Welcome to our pilot series of Operation Transmit Leadership. Operation Transmit Leadership is an audio program of local leaders providing insight and mentoring about servant leadership. This program is produced by Michiana-based volunteer team. Program guests are local leaders from all backgrounds, professions, and callings who are recognized for demonstrating outstanding leadership by serving others.
Thank you for joining Operation Transmit Leadership for our second interview in a series of servant leadership mentoring programs. I am Kyle Bradamus, and I am joined by Operation Transmit Leader member Jody Russell. Together we will be interviewing a well-known Michiana servant leader, South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Mayor Pete, welcome to our program.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Mayor Pete, in your own words, can you describe for us what servant leadership is to you?
So when I think about leaders that I really admire, the thing that always strikes me is the sense of putting the mission first. Mm-hmm. And so, when we hear about the idea of servant leadership, I think it means a couple of things. One is service to whatever community is being led, whether that's a business organization, a team of some kind, or even a political community. But I think it's also an idea about service to the mission. And one thing that I think all admirable leaders have in common is the ability to put that mission first and to put it ahead of personal concerns and to really motivate others to have fidelity to that purpose as well. Because that's why it makes a difference that it's one leader and not another in a given leadership role, is that kind of fidelity to whatever that mission, whatever that purpose, whatever that project is that propels you to do the work in the first place.
Thank you.
In your opinion, what makes servant leadership differ from other leadership styles?
Well, I think sometimes people might confuse prominence with leadership, that if you have a title or if you're very visible, that's leadership. I think being visible gives you an opportunity for leadership, but that's not necessarily the same thing. So I think when you talk about servant leadership as an ideal, it really fuses the idea of being in a position of authority, or even without having any official authority, being in a position to move or lead other people. It fuses that idea with a sense of purpose. And I think often there's no way to really do that properly without setting the self aside, setting the ego aside. So if we think about forms of so-called leadership that have to do with the sort of glorification of the leader, to me that's not leadership at all. I often fall back on military training. One of the things that you see in the military is a very strong hierarchy. All officers have a certain authority over all enlisted soldiers or sailors or airmen or Marines, but there are also some very strong codes that are followed. For example, an officer should never eat before every enlisted person is served. And that's just one example of the idea that if you're going to have some kind of authority, it needs to be backed up by demonstrating that you're putting the people that you serve first, so that you can effectively lead them.
Awesome, thank you.
Can you walk us through some history on how you got to where you are in terms of leadership philosophy and experience?
Sure. So I mostly came out of the business world. That was where I had my first real responsibilities. It was actually through a series of formative experiences on teams. So I was at a consulting firm, McKinsey, and the way that firm works is they tend to send very small teams in to deal with very big questions. So, for example, I worked on a study related to the pricing of groceries, and it was a $1 billion question. It was, how do you invest about $1 billion in price cuts, according to an organization? But it was a very small team. It was about 5 of us at any given time. And the question was, how do we take the resources that we bring to the client and make sure that we are using those resources to help them answer that question? And so all the time you had to think about what the client interest was and put that first. And at the same time also think about how to take care of the team and make sure everybody on the team was functioning well, that we were supporting each other, that we were keeping our eye on the ball. Same thing in the military. So every effective leader that I've seen in the military, the thing you really notice about them is that they are in tune with the interests of the team that they're serving, as well as the mission that they're serving. And there can be a tension between those things, right? I mean, sometimes you want to get the mission done, and that means driving everybody to the point that they break, but that's not good for the team. Similarly, sometimes if you're only thinking about making sure that that everybody's happy, that everybody's comfortable. Sometimes you got to make people uncomfortable in order to make sure they get the job done. And so, watching that tension play out, I think both in the business world and in the military world, as well as the political campaign world, really shaped how I approach the mayor's office and my view that whether it's me or any of the department heads here in the city, need to do that same thing, strike that same balance. Where on one hand, you're responsible for the well-being of a team. You got to make sure people are in good shape and motivated and taking care of themselves. And on the other hand, we have incredibly important work ahead of us. And so we have to work very hard, and we have to be uncomfortable sometimes in order to get the work done. Whether that means pushing really hard in terms of work, or whether it means being willing to have difficult conversations or talking to people we wouldn't normally talk to, because you might have some tough customers out there, but you've got to in order to get the job done. And I think that balance is at the very heart of what it means to be a good leader.
At what point did you want to be or realize that you were a servant leader?
Well, I think, even as a student, I admired great leaders who had that servant mentality. I think that was even part of something that was drilled into me in Catholic school. And certainly as somebody who studied history and looked at a lot of the leaders who brought about the most change. They weren't necessarily ones who who relied on formal authority alone to get stuff done. Many of the leaders I admire were political leaders. A lot of them weren't. Some of the leaders in the civil rights movement, some of the leaders who brought down apartheid in South Africa. These are people who may have had informal roles, informal authority, but a great deal of moral authority through who they were and what they cared about. And so I think that was an example that always stuck with me. I'm not sure I knew what that would mean for me. I spent the better part of my high school years wanting to be an airline pilot. I still think that's actually a pretty great job. But I knew that, by the time I was emerging from college, I knew that I'd been given a chance to make a difference just with the education that I'd received. And by the time I got to Oxford, where I was completely funded by a scholarship, when a lot of other people's money goes into your education, you really think about how you're going to make yourself useful and make it worth their while to have invested in you. And so by then I was interested. I didn't know what shape it was going to take, but I was interested in finding a way to make a difference.
Awesome.
Can you describe to us what motivates you to be a servant leader?
Well, I come at it from the perspective of serving a community, right? This is home. This is a city of 100,000 people. It's where I grew up. And I've got a board of directors, if you will, of 100,000 voters, or at least residents, many of whom are voters. And so, the thing that motivates me on a regular, daily basis, the thing that propels me, is to make sure that we're doing a good job. It's in the very word, the term public service. It's service, right? We're not here for ourselves. Although it's very rewarding work and I enjoy it, at least most of the time. But you've got to hold yourself accountable for the purpose that brings us here. And we spent a lot of time developing a very specific mission statement for the city, which is that we deliver services that empower everyone to thrive. And we think about that a lot because we know that the city can't necessarily make people thrive. A government can't decide whether people are going to be well off or poorly off, but we are definitely responsible for some of the conditions that can affect whether people can thrive. If your road is not properly plowed or paved, you're going to have a harder time doing whatever it is you care about in life. I don't even have to know what it is, but I can tell it'll be harder if you don't have a good road. And the same goes for all the things that we do, from clean, safe drinking water to public safety to fire suppression to economic development, parks, making sure people have great places. And I think anybody in an elected position has to recognize that you have a role. It's almost like we're the custodians, we're maintenance. The better we are at our job, the less you even know we're here. Because we're really just trying to get these things squared away so that you don't have to think about them. So that whatever it is that's important to you in your life, whether it's got to do with faith and family or whether it's got to do with building a business, or I don't have to know what your life is about to know that I have an obligation and that my team has an obligation to make it a little bit easier by making sure the city's doing a good job.
When you began leading through servant leadership, did you see an impact on those around you? And if so, what was it?
Well, I think especially in a job like this, you're working with a team all the time. And in this case, you're working very closely with the team because we work ridiculously long hours, and we're often in kind of close quarters in office spaces or running around the community trying to get stuff done. And so we all have an effect on each other. What I've tried to do is make sure that I use the position that's handed to me in terms of the mayor's office to set a certain tone, set a certain tempo, but also know when to take the cues from the people who report to me rather than the other way around. So we have an outreach director whose full-time job is to really make sure we're in tune with the needs of the community and the people who may not have the connections to always be, getting the attention of the mayor's office, to make sure they get heard too. You've got a public works director who is an expert in engineering and the science of running a city, making sure that the water is moving around right and the roads are getting paved. Everyone who reports to me is better at whatever it is they do than I would be. And so we all have an effect on each other. My role, I think, is to make sure everybody's in touch with the mission, to make sure we get the big things right, the concepts, the direction, and then to jump in whenever there's a question either between different priorities that are competing or between different values, which can also happen. Sometimes you can't, in fact, this is where I think, political leaders earn their paycheck, is sometimes you can't satisfy all of the values you care about at the same time. And so you got to pick some. And that's one of the reasons I think we'll always have people rather than mathematical formulas or computers making political decisions. Because sometimes the only way to make some people worse off is to make a choice, or better off, that is to make a choice that'll make some people worse off. And when you're confronted with that, all you can do is really lean back on the values that guide you. In the case of our administration, we've got 5. It's excellence, making sure we're the best or among the best at everything we do. Accountability, making sure people can tell what we're doing and why and how well we're doing it. Inclusion, making sure that we have everybody at the table or everybody represented who has a stake. Innovation, which means not so much technology, but ensuring that we don't just do things out of habit, but that we welcome new ideas. And empowerment, this idea that everybody in the city and in the administration team should be empowered to do the best job that they can and to live the best life that they can. And so to the extent that I can be the voice of those values, then it can help other people start to make the decisions that they're confronted with on a daily basis in the administration and make sure we're all pulling in the same direction.
That's great. A lot of leaders can learn from that strategy.
Can you give us an example of how you were positively affected by someone practicing servant leadership?
Certainly I've been part of a lot of teams where that idea that being in charge actually means that you're in charge of supporting everybody else has really been dominant. I had a couple of very good managers in the business world who had that mentality. They always made sure we were in good shape, and also really established boundaries around how long we were going to work, what things were going to command our attention, and what things we could let go. Same thing with some of the best military commanders I've worked with. People who've made it possible for us to organize to move forward on a mission, but also made it clear that they were committed to our success, and even if it wasn't the easiest thing for them, by never asking us to do something that they wouldn't do as well. And again, I think that's the right kind of mentality for political leaders to have too.
Are there recent or past examples of servant leadership from our local history that stand out to you as part of our community's success?
Well, I think our community is full of great leadership, and I think a lot of people have that mentality. What's exciting about the moment that we're living in right now is I think you can see a lot of people pulling in the same direction, even though they have very separate jobs. So you've got a business community where even the smallest businesses are really seeing themselves as invested in the success of the community. Look at what some of our restaurants are doing, our bars and restaurants and even food trucks to invest in the community. And you see these people, that they're working their heart out in order to support their team and make sure that the business succeeds as well. You see that in our bigger institutions. If you look at the leadership of either of the major hospitals in the area, whether it's Beacon Memorial that's right here in South Bend, or St. Joe, which is also very active in the community, you see it there. You look at our university leadership. We got 5 colleges and universities in South Bend. Every one of them, I think, is in good hands. And if you look, just to take one example, if you look at Father John at Notre Dame and the way that he has really prioritized the involvement in the community of a university that really could just close itself in and put up a wall and ignore the community. And that may have been the instinct, the dominant instinct in previous eras, but has really, certainly for as long as I've been mayor, really been the other direction. But not just as a service project, but as a real partnership. And I think that's that's another attribute of good leadership, is that you don't, even when you're trying to help somebody, you can't do it in a condescending way. You've got to be engaging side by side. We've got a lot of leaders in our faith community who have that same approach. In fact, in this room, very frequently I'll have a different mix of people from the faith community, different faith traditions, and the thing that they all have in common is they're not asking questions for or about themselves. They're asking about how the people who they encounter on a daily basis can be made better off. And I think that's exactly the kind of example that we want to see more of. I think it's one of the reasons that South Bend's recovery has been so strong and is really accelerating in the last few years.
Mayor Pete, how would you encourage someone to develop servant leadership habits? And secondly, where would you recommend that they find more information regarding that?
Well, I think leadership is one of those things it's something that has to be learned, but it's very difficult to be taught. So I think the best thing you can do is identify people who embody that kind of leadership, and then stick around them, watch what they do, and try to be part of that. It's one of the things I always have tried to do in my career is whether it's at the firm or in politics, finding somebody I admire and then watching what they do and trying to remain in their world. I think that there's no better way to learn also than by doing, right? So I think the trick, of course, is not to get too absorbed either in, when I talked about those two tensions before, not to get too absorbed in making sure you and your team are happy that you forget about the mission, and also vice versa, not being so absorbed in getting from point A to point B that you forget about your team. And so that's where I think engaging outside advice is really helpful. I got a sticky note on my desk that just says, "Who did you take advice from today?" Because if you're talking to the same people all the time, it's going to turn into an echo chamber. And you may even find yourself selecting people to talk to who are going to tell you stuff you want to hear, right? Much better if you can make sure you're always engaging people who are a little bit outside the picture, whether it's other people in positions of leadership. So I will frequently ask maybe a CEO or a university president or a pastor in the area just to get lunch so that we can talk and I can find out how they really think I'm doing. And the best ones will tell you whether you want to hear it or not. But it's also why we do things like we do this Mayor's Night Out event. So every couple months we'll go to a school or a community center. We'll take we'll set up a table and I'll just sit and talk to any resident who wants to sit down and talk. And you never know what they're going to come up with. But it's really important to keep doing that because if I want to be a servant leader, I got to be in touch with the people I think I'm serving, right? And it does no good for me to think I'm doing things that benefit them if they don't feel the same way. Now, sometimes I'll believe that an unpopular decision is the right one, and some folks may not agree with me in the short term, but if we get it right in the long term, most people will know that they're better off. And if we get it wrong, that's what elections are for.
Thank you.
What advice would you give to someone who is just learning about servant leadership?
Well, I think we learn best through stories. So I think if you're trying to get a sense of how different kinds of leadership work, it is most useful to study leaders, good and bad ones, and try to figure out what went well and what went poorly, how mistakes are made, how not to repeat them, and how great achievements came about too. And there are a lot of different ways to do that, from asking around to studying history to examining what's happening in the world around you. But I think at the end of the day, you got to find the stories that most powerfully illustrate the kinds of leaders we all hope to be, and then figure out what to emulate. But also always put ourselves in the shoes of somebody making those decisions and imagine what we would do different. You can't lead people to where they already are. I think anybody entering a leadership position or situation is there because there's some situation they want to change in some way. And that means understanding the difference between where you would lead people and where somebody else would, so that it matters that it's you and not somebody else in those shoes. And so, I think when you're evaluating any community, any team, I mean, from a volunteer group that you're involved with, all the way up to running a major organization, you need to look at it where it is, think about what you wish were different, and then be prepared to change it. And at the same time, really engage all the different people who are affected. And so, if someone is, for example, in a position professionally where they're just beginning to be handed leadership responsibilities, it's a good moment to try to make sure that you're looking in all directions, that you're asking a lot of questions and getting a lot of feedback from people above you organizationally, below you organizationally, and around you. And a few people who have nothing to do with it, who are in a different field. I mean, the last piece of advice I would give is that, if you're in politics, talk to somebody from business. If you're in business, talk to somebody in sports. If you're in sports, talk to somebody in the faith community. Like, figure out, because that's when you start to see the patterns emerge. And there are some things about leadership that are, of course, unique to the field that you're in. There are other things that are the same basic principles, whether you're reading, a technical manual or whether you're reading scripture. And so trying to make sure that you draw on all the different fields of human experience to get a sense of what you care about and what matters to you. I think that's the most powerful way to inform yourself and to broaden your horizon and make yourself useful to other people, which is hopefully what it's all about.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you, Mayor Pete, for sharing your views on servant leadership.
Thanks for having me.
Listeners can find more information about Mayor Pete and the City of South Bend at the city's website, southbendin.gov. Thank you for listening. Next month's interview will be with Becky Summers, President and CEO at Ronald McDonald House and Charities of Michiana. The opinions expressed in this program are of the guests and are not explicitly those of the Operation Transmit Leadership Group. Our guests are volunteers and have donated their time to promote servant leadership.
This Operation Transmit Leadership program was produced by Kyle Bradamus, Kayla Myers, Mike Davalski, Jody Russell, Laura Veramontes, and Chris Wolf. You can find more programs on our Facebook page, Operation Transmit Leadership.
Any views or opinions represented in this series of audio interviews are personal and belong solely to Operation Transmit Leadership and do not represent those of people, institutions, or organizations that the owner may or may not be associated with in professional or personal capacity, unless explicitly stated. Any views or opinions are not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, or individual. All content provided on the audio program series is for informational purposes only. Operation Transmit Leadership will not be liable for any errors or omissions in this information, nor for the availability of this information. The program, producers, and participants will not be liable for any losses, injuries, or damages from the listening, displaying, or any other use of this content or information. Any content usage or reproduction is not authorized without the explicit approval of the Operation Transmit Leadership team.